Canonical's video introduction to Ubuntu 17.10. If you've been following the Linux world at all, you know this has been an entire year for spring cleaning. Early in 2017, Canonical stopped work on its homegrown Unity desktop mere display server, and its larger vision of convergence, a unified interface for Ubuntu for phones, tablets, and desktops. And now, almost exactly 6 years after Ubuntu first switched from GNOME 2 to the Unity desktop, that has been dropped, too. The distro is back to GNOME, and Canonical recently released Ubuntu 17.10, a major update with some significant changes coming to the popular Ubuntu Linux operating system. In light of the GNOME switch, this release seems like more of a homecoming than an entirely new voyage. But that said, Ubuntu 17.10 simultaneously feels very much like the start of a new voyage for Ubuntu. The last few Ubuntu desktop releases have been about as exciting as OpenSSH releases. You know you need to update, but beyond that, no one really cares. Sure, there have been a few feature updates with each new numeric increment, perhaps some slightly more up-to-date GNOME and GTK components under the hood. But by and large, Ubuntu's Unity 7 desktop has been in maintenance mode for several years. That period of stagnation turned Ubuntu from one of the more interesting operating systems around into just another Linux distro barely worthy of mention. This trend changes with 17.10. There are big changes, an entirely new default desktop in fact, but this release feels different not because the desktop has changed, but because Ubuntu feels like it once again has a sense of focus and direction. Even Canonical's letter-based naming scheme has arrived at a starting over point. Artful Aardvark is 17.10's nickname. Desktop despondency. Desktop users paying close attention to Ubuntu may not like the renewed sense of focus and direction, since much of the chatter, features, and tools coming out of Canonical right now are geared toward the server, container, and what the kids call the Internet of Things IoT releases. While it's true that's where Canonical's bottom line lies, and without giving some attention to its paying customers, there won't be a Canonical that ignores the fact that Canonical put tremendous effort into transitioning away from Unity and building a replacement desktop out of GNOME. If Canonical really didn't care about the desktop, it wouldn't have put in any effort at all. It would have been much easier to just get rid of the desktop entirely, but that's not what happened. In a blog post announcing 17.10, Ubuntu founder Mark Shuttleworth encourages users to pick a desktop. "We're using GNOME," he writes, "but we're the space where KDE and GNOME and Mate and many others come together to give users real and easy choice of desktops. And if you're feeling burned by the lack of Unity in open source, you might want to hop onto the channel and join those who are updating Unity 7 for the newest X and kernel graphics in 18.04. That last bit hints at the future of desktop Ubuntu, so does a recent call for community input on a new Ubuntu desktop theme. These messages point to a new Ubuntu desktop, one that's much more community-centric. Canonical got rid of most of its design team, so in one sense it has no choice but to farm these things out to the community. But that's not the entire story here. This is pure conjecture on my part, but I think Canonical's course reversal on convergence goes much deeper than just abandoning Unity. Canonical shows signs of also abandoning its sometimes rather rigid belief system as well. Gone are the days when feature requests were dismissed as won't fix simply because they conflicted with some designer's vision of how the desktop should work. Instead, I believe that Ubuntu realized its mistake wasn't just pursuing convergence, but that convergence wasn't what its users wanted. I believe that the new Canonical, the new Ubuntu, is going to listen more closely to its community. I also think that the desktop release will eventually be spun off as a community-driven product only loosely affiliated with Canonical. Shuttleworth has already said Canonical is prepping for an IPO, hence the focus on money-making uses of Ubuntu embedded, server, etc. If that happens, the desktop will very likely slide to the side. There's plenty of prior art here. Think Fedora and Red Hat, OpenSUSE and SUSE, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it can be good. Keeping things separate allows the desktop to develop and grow largely independent of Canonical's bottom line. So 17.10 is a major release for Ubuntu, not just because it's a brand new desktop experience for users, but also because it's likely a preview of what's coming in the next long-term support release, Ubuntu 18.04, coming April 2018. Enlarge the stock GNOME desktop in Ubuntu 17.10. Ubuntu 17.10 GNOME. The Unity desktop is gone, rather it's available in the archives, which is to say it's gone for all but the die-hard fans looking for an obscure cause to get behind. Instead, Ubuntu 17.10 boots into GNOME shell by default. The first time you log in to 17.10, you'll notice that it doesn't look all that different from the last release. Ubuntu's developers have put considerable effort into making GNOME cosmetically similar to Unity. Unfortunately, in some important ways, the similarities are only skin deep. Much of Unity's appeal was in the small things that greatly improved its usability relative GNOME, for example the keyboard-driven HUD, the global menu, the nice notification system, and several other innovations present in Unity are also available in the archives, which is to say, they're gone. How much this matters to your experience with Ubuntu 17.10 depends on how much you used any of these things and how well GNOME plugins can mimic them. Let's start with the bad news. Your transition to GNOME will be painful if you were a heavy user of the HUD features in Unity. There is no GNOME plugin to pick up the slack. There are some admirable efforts underway, but in my testing none of them was ready for prime time. Worse, this is the kind of feature request that will have you hounded right off the GNOME developer mailing list, so don't even bother. GNOME will never have a HUD undo your muscle memory and move on, or stick with Ubuntu 17.04 until it reaches end of life in January 2018. To stick with Unity, Ubuntu 16.04 represents the most recent LTS version, as it'll reach end of life in April 2021. Users who wish to remain with Unity are better advised to use Ubuntu 16.04, the most recent LTS version, which will reach end of life in April 2021. If the HUD wasn't your go-to tool in Unity, then the transition to GNOME will be less painful. In fact, most of what Unity could do can be imitated with GNOME plugins. Want Ubuntu-style notifications and indicators? There's an extension for that. Want a global menu? There's an extension for that as well, but alas, it doesn't really work. Want a working global menu? Ubuntu 17.04 is for you. Searching in GNOME is a little different than it is in Unity. Ubuntu 17.10 features the latest version of GNOME files. The GNOME top bar menu's composite screenshot. Still, Ubuntu 17.10 is at least visually similar to its predecessors, which helps smooth the transition to GNOME somewhat. And since Unity was built on top of the same GTK libraries, GNOME components, and GNOME apps, most of the apps and interfaces you'll see and need to find in Ubuntu 17.10 are either identical or very similar to the Unity counterparts. In some cases, however, even the familiar will feel a little strange. Files, the default GNOME File Manager app, is a good example of this. For Unity 7, Ubuntu used an older version of Files and heavily patched it to add some functionality that had long since been deleted by the GNOME developers. With 17.10, Files is up to date, and those features are gone. One thing that Ubuntu did manage to hack in there is support for the desktop as a place to put stuff. The GNOME developers apparently consider the desktop just a wallpaper display tool, but with Ubuntu you can actually put launchers, folders, and files on your desktop. That should be welcome news for many Ubuntu users. The top bar in GNOME behaves a little differently than the top bar in Unity. It has app indicators, status messages, network controls, and user sessions like Unity, but the top bar also adds a different app menu, a calendar applet in the center of the screen. There's also something like a global menu, minus the menu. When apps are maximized, the name of the app appears in the top menu along with one item. Menu quit is generally your only option. A couple of apps have a few extra items in the menus, terminal and files for example, but it's a far cry from Unity. There's one other thing you'll notice in this release: the window management buttons are back on the right side of each title bar. Back when Unity first arrived, Ubuntu moved the buttons to the left or wrong side of the window in the name of innovation. Actually, there was a pretty good reason for the change. When you made a window full screen in Unity, the buttons became part of the top bar, and you can't do that when buttons are on the right side. But with the unified top bar now a thing of the past, there's no reason to have the buttons on the left side. If you really liked them over there, you can change the setting in the GNOME Tweak tool. Once you get past the differences with Unity, there's much to like about this release. GNOME Shell is different from Unity, but it's not necessarily worse. It's certainly a pretty desktop, especially if you swap out the default theme that ships with 17.10 for something a little sleeker. I happen to like the dark variant of the Arc theme, something Ubuntu itself is planning to do before 18.04 LTS arrives. The default GNOME apps are generally the same as what you had in 17.04, but as noted above, some are quite a bit newer. Files and Terminal are the most notable of those. For those already well familiar with GNOME, Ubuntu 17.10 ships with GNOME 3.26, which is notable for its improved, streamlined search view, a new settings app called Control Center rather than Settings, and full-text search support for files. There's also an interesting feature buried in the GNOME web app the GNOME browser no one uses. It now supports Firefox Sync, which means you can sync your bookmarks, history, passwords, and open tabs between Firefox and web. So if you want to see what web is like, now you can at least do it and keep everything you've got set up in Firefox. In the end, what you get with GNOME in 17.10 is close enough to Unity that it doesn't take more than a couple of days to wrap your head around the differences and get on with your work. It's worth noting that in my testing, GNOME uses slightly more RAM and CPU than Unity on the same hardware doing the same things. The increase is only about 10% more on the RAM, and, let's face it, neither of them are lightweight desktops. If you want something light, try i3. Listing image by Ubuntu page 2. An array of applications at your fingertips in 17.10. Move that dock wherever you'd like and have it auto-hide when not in use. Greeting the world in LibreOffice. It's easy to view what windows are open and switch in 17.10. Once you start digging below the GNOME surface of 17.10, you'll find quite a few reasons to upgrade, both on the desktop and, perhaps even more so, in the server edition. While Mir never arrived, Ubuntu has left Zurg behind, replacing it with the Wayland display server. If you've got the hardware to support it, Wayland will be the default. There are still some annoyances about Wayland, particularly with anything that needs access to your display, apps like Redshift, screen capture tools, and the like, but aside from those issues you're unlikely to notice that you're using Wayland. It's worth mentioning that the 32-bit installation image is no more. Ubuntu previously offered both 32-bit and 64-bit installation images. With the 17.10 release, there's only 64-bit ISOs. Before you freak out, bear in mind that all the 32-bit libraries and apps are still around, so you can upgrade existing systems without issue. And if you want a fresh install, there's still a 32-bit minimal ISO available. Install the base system from that, and you can just install all the graphical tools you need on your own. The 32-bit road is, however, looking like it's narrowing down and probably won't be widening. Ubuntu won't be the first distro to drop support completely. Ubuntu 17.10 includes the Linux kernel 4.13, which has some fixes for SNAP-related security vulnerabilities, initial support for Intel Canonical chips, some 3D support for the Nouveau open-source NVIDIA drivers, Thunderbolt improvements, and the usual slew of odds and ends updates, patches, and improvements. The server edition of Ubuntu 17.10 has a host of new features for sysadmins and developers, including the latest Kubernetes now at 1.8, the latest release of OpenStack, updates for most languages, Python 3.6, Python 2 is gone by default, still in the repos, though, and LXD 2.18, which has a slew of bug fixes and minor improvements for container deployments. Alternatives. While I highly encourage you to take Ubuntu 17.10 for a spin, try it in VirtualBox so you don't have to commit. If you do and really hate it, there are, as Shuttleworth mentions, KDE and GNOME and Mate and many others. Of those, I would suggest starting with Ubuntu Mate, which in some ways has more Unity-style features than the default GNOME release. Mate takes the more traditional approach to the desktop. Out of the box you'll find a Start menu button, toolbars, and your usual desktop features like trash, folders, and files. GNOME Shell this is not. But Ubuntu Mate 17.10 has two things for unhappy Unity refugees: global menu support and the HUD search tool. These features are available in 3 of Mate's many panel layout options: Mutiny, Cupertino, and Contemporary. Of these, Mutiny is the unit-inspired layout. You'll need to head into the Mate Tweak tool to switch to Mutiny, but once you do, you can have your HUD back, and it works almost exactly like the Unity version. You can search and run menu bar commands without taking your fingers off the keyboard. Like regular Unity, it supports GTK and Qt applications. Conclusion: Ubuntu 17.10 is a huge departure for Ubuntu, but one that sees the distro seemingly getting its footing back. The transition to GNOME, while not without its pitfalls for some users, is surprisingly smooth. Unity did have some features you won't find in GNOME, but Canonical has done a good job of making things familiar, if not identical. More important than individual features in 17.10, this release sees Ubuntu starting over to some degree. The long development process of Unity 8 was threatening to turn it into Godot, but now Ubuntu is free of Unity 8. Its users no longer have to wait for anything. Correction: this piece originally identified Ubuntu 17.04 as an LTS release supported till 2020. A reader pointed out that, in fact, Ubuntu 16.04 is the most recent Unity using LTS being supported till 2021. Ars regrets the error and has updated the text above accordingly.